Hello, I would like to welcome you to the first webinar of our seminar entitled Automation and Digitalization in Contemporary Capitalism. The seminar is jointly organized by 3 research groups in different Brazilian universities, namely the Research Group in the Political Economy of Development, Grupo de Pesquisa em Economia Política do Desenvolvimento at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte, the Research Group in Economy, Society and Technology, Núcleo de Estudos em Economia, Tecnologia e Sociedade at the Federal University of Ceará, and the DigiLabor Research Lab, Grupo de Pesquisa DigiLabor at the Unicinos University. Today our guest speaker is Cédric Durand, who kindly accepted our invitation to present and discuss his new book. Cédric Durand is an economist at the Genève University. He works on contemporary capitalism, globalization, and financialization. He previously wrote Le Capital Fictif, and he published last year Technofeudalisme, Critique de l'économie numérique. The book's the subject of our presentation today. So we will start with Cédric's presentation, and afterwards we will have a Q&A session. So Cédric, thank you for being today with us, and you now have the floor.
Esther, hello everybody. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to present my book to you today. So I will present the broad argument of the book, and I think that if you want, we can get more into the precise discussion of some aspect of it in the Q&A following my presentation. So everything seems to be nice at the beginning. That was the Californian ideology of the 70s. And at that moment, there was a big, in California, big movement of self-organizations, democracy, and in the meantime, there was an aspiration along with this anti-authoritarian dynamics, there was an aspiration toward a technological, nice technological future, bright technological future. And these books from Ernst Kallenbach, Ecotopia, was probably the last utopia, in the sense that he explained a bright future for California, where anti-authoritarian dynamics goes along very well with very bright technological dynamics. And this Californian ideology is still very much present up to nowadays. For example, in France, the countries where I come from. And a few years ago, President Macron, just elected, tweeted, "I want France to be a startup nation, a nation that thinks and moves like a startup." And why was he saying that? Because in one sense, the startup is the heroine of our time. Why? Because the startup realized the immediate unity of 2 perfectly desirable aspirations. First, on the one hand, you have the prospect of a full professional autonomy, bringing the satisfaction of working life that is both intense and fun. And in the meantime, you have a collective adventure where also the risk of failure is great. The distant glory of invention and fortune already put balms in the heart. Well, there was also, in the meantime, as we had this Californian ideology, or maybe a little bit later in the 80s, there was also a kind of underground critical movement that developed a less bright future in terms of the fusion of technology and capitalism. And this was the case in the realm of cyberpunk. Cyberpunk was a cultural movement which go along with players, gamers, and in this playbook of the late 80s, they define the rules of the game, so some kind of character, some kind of scene, of some kinds of rules, and so on. And there is an economic section, and in this section, there is this concept of techno-feudalism. And what is techno-feudalism in their view? It's a reaction to a chaotic environment where you have giant firms whose power exceeds that of the state, and that they guarantee some kind of support and protection to their to people working with them, to their clients, and to some suppliers, if you want, but in exchange to very strong loyalty. And in this sense, this techno-feudal power of this corporation is an inseparably political and economic power over the controlled spaces. And basically, the idea of the book comes from this kind of negative anticipation of the process of the digital economy. I will ask, if you want, the question, what went wrong? We had this Californian ideology, but it didn't realize, and instead of that, we had a kind of regressive dynamics in contemporary capitalism that gives rise to what I propose to call techno-feudalism. So first, I will expose, moving away from the Californian ideology, what is the Silicon Valley consensus, which in fact is a more policy-oriented set of norms. Then I will expose very rapidly its main paradoxes, what, if you want, what didn't went good, what the unexpected dynamics that resulted of these policies. And then we will move toward more the political economy of digital domination. And then I will present very briefly my techno-feudal hypothesis. And finally, as an opening, I will discuss the misfortunes of socialization and what could be done, very broad policy orientations. So first, the Silicon Valley consensus. In fact, the concept is not from me, it's from Michael Pure. And in fact, he put the emphasis about the kind of policies that arise out of the Californian ideology and then moved into a strong set of policy tools. And if you want, an important shift was at the turn of the 80s around figures such as Stewart Brand. These people were very much involved in the IP counterculture in California in the 70s, but already in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, they mixed with businesses in order to think about how entrepreneurship, capitalist entrepreneurship, can be mixed with the IP optimism concerning technology. And there is not a lot of common ground between these two dimensions, but the small common ground is this idea of the ability of the individuals to raise their project, to develop themselves, and to transform the world. And this hyper-individualist dimension is very important in this junction of global businesses, if you want, on the one hand, and conservative politics, and the counterculture on the other hand. Just to be clear, that do not mean that everybody from the counterculture moved toward this kind of right-wing version of these tendencies, but there was some space of overlapping. So, if you want, the first document that crystallized this conservative turn is this Magna Carta for the Knowledge Age. That has been commissioned by the Progress and Freedom Foundation, which is a business think tank. And in this document, they argument the following. They said that the central event of the 20th century is the reversal of matter, and that now the power of the minds are everywhere, rising above the breadth of things. So basically, that's kind of folk culture concerning digitalization, early digitalization. But they use this as a way to push a very strong political agenda. And their key point is that the era of massification is behind us. We are entering an era of demassification. Why? First, there is, thanks to digitalization, a strong reduction of transaction cost. A strong reduction of transaction cost, that means that you can open new markets. You can have new interactions between entrepreneurs. So you can have a much more fine-grained market division of labor. Then you have also strong critique of the state and of planning. And basically, they say that that will be very much too complicated, and there will be no space for state or big bureaucracy in this age of knowledge that can circulate freely. And here there is no strong argument on that. That just, if you want, an ideological statement, because there is no mechanism that can stress the fact that bureaucracy could not use digital technology. But okay, from their point of view, that's a way to disqualify these kind of things. And then you have this idea of an economy of small entrepreneurs. And basically that they explain that you can have micro trade, micro investment, micro culture. So basically that's the dream of capitalism of small entrepreneurs, not big corporations, but many small capitalists. That's this kind of things that they are playing with. And they say that what is very important is that the state must stay neutral in that process. It should not intervene. There should not be any kind of industrial policies. And they say that removing obstacles to competition and massively deregulating is the main way that you can help to accelerate this process of technological change in the field of telecommunication and IT sector. But they have also a kind of moral view of what's going on. And this moral view is kind of very disturbing. This is a figure of Ayn Rand. Maybe some of you know Ayn Rand, and they refer to her because she's really the hyper-individualist figure. She's legitimating the action of the entrepreneurs, no matter what are their consequences. According to her, people are on their own right to disrupt the reality in order to innovate, to change the world individually. And the only things that the state must do, and for anyone and for these people, this is very important, is to define and protect property rights. And the main message of the Magna Carta is define property right in the new cyberspace. Cyberspace is a new land, is a new territory, and the government must only intervene in order to legitimate and defend property rights of the pioneers of this new land. Okay, so that's, if you want, the first kind of hybrid policy orientation that is elaborated in the early 90s. But very rapidly, this began to be the official position of the US. And that was not given. When he was elected, Bill Clinton, in fact, has a more traditional view of industrial policy. He was talking about protectionism and so on. But very rapidly, as soon as 1996, 1997, there is a new bipartisan consensus in Washington around the idea that I'm quoting here Newt Gingrich, that the US can build an exciting information age, economically dominant America, and then the rest of the world will follow them. So that this idea that thanks to this high-tech revolution, there is a new opportunity for the US to lead the world. And this idea will be taken on board by the Clinton administration. And you had this document from Ira Magaziner of 1997 that explained what will be the orientation of the US in world politics. And they explained that they need to fight for deregulation in order to allow the development of high tech, and that states should not step in. And they will push very much for that in the WTO, OECD, and other regional forums, with this idea that the private sector must take the initiative, that state must protect competition on the one hand and intellectual property rights on the other hand, but that they should not step in at all. So really that's, if you want, in a more polite way and without the figure of Ayn Rand officially taken on board, but that's the same idea as that the Carta Magna for the knowledge age. And then you have a more academic view on that. It's the neo-Schumpeterian view that is developed a little bit later, and that is officially accepted by the OECD at the beginning of the millennium. And this neo-Schumpeterian view, so from Schumpeter idea of creative destruction, is mobilized as a consequence of the analysis that they make of the success of the US economy in the late 90s. You know that in the second half of the 90s, there has been a brief period of rapid growth, rapid investment, along with a bubble in high tech in the US. And in 2000, when they make an assessment of what was going on, people from the OECD explained that there are mainly three lessons that could be taken from this success of the US. First, the idea of creative destruction. So creative destruction is really the new is replacing the old. So there should be enough competition to destroy the old structure and to allow more productive firms to step in. Second idea, that what is very strong in the US and that is very relevant for this process of creative destruction is flexibility. Flexibility in labor markets, so entrepreneurs should be free to fire workers, and flexibility in capital markets. So that this idea that business angels and sophisticated financial products will help to fund innovation. And finally, there is this idea of incentives. That is something a little bit different that was not that much present, if you want, in the old Washington consensus. And this idea of incentives is the idea that defending property rights is super important because that will incentivize, that will limit competition for a moment, but that will incentivize entrepreneurs to develop their activity. They say also that competition must be, there should be also taxation relatively low in order to allow capitalists to benefit from their innovation. So you have here the core of this neo-Schumpeterian Californian Silicon Valley consensus. So three ideas: creative destruction, flexibility on markets, and strong defense of property rights and low taxation in order to incentivize entrepreneurs to innovate. Okay, so if you remember well what I was beginning with, we have this idea that thanks to the new technology, we will have new markets, we will have more dynamic entrepreneurships, and if the state do not step in, we will have a more prosperous society. But also, as markets are changing very rapidly, we will have not that much inequality because entrepreneurship will allow everybody to be an entrepreneur. Of course, when we look at that 30 years later, that's kind of embarrassing. That's not what occurs at all. So we will go back to this paradox. First, I would like to say that in one sense, that's not only this kind of neoliberal figures that think that there is a kind of progressive dimension in startups and in small capitals. You can go to Rosa Luxemburg, and we are just right now remembering her for 150 years. And she used to wrote that small capital is a pioneer of technical progress, which is itself the essential motor of the capitalist economy. So this idea that you could have a kind of new wave of dynamism in capitalism thanks to small capitals and technological innovation is kind of interesting. Why not? However, if you look at what occurred, that's more troubling. We truly have a strong techno-organizational disruption. If you look 20 years from now, in 2000, the biggest firm in the world, most of them were oil firms, oil corporations, or some of them were industrial corporations or financial corporations. Nowadays, most big firms, most big corporations are corporations from the tech industry. We have 7 over 10 biggest capitalization in the world are from tech firms, most of them from the US and some of them from China. So we had this techno-organizational disruption. However, and I will not stress that very much because you are probably aware of that, we observe in the meantime a strong monopolization. These firms are monopolists or quasi-monopolists. Amazon is growing very rapidly in the e-commerce sector and is occupying a very dominant position. We have Facebook in the that is also having a very strong position in the social network activities, and Google in search dimension. And we know also that these firms are kind of colonizing other kind of activities, so are expanding their reach in the economy at the intersectoral level. So we have this strong dynamics of monopolization that is very much at odds with this idea of small capitals competing dynamically. Second paradox, we have great fatigue of capitalism. We do not have at all a very strong and revival of capitalism in terms of productivity and growth. So you probably know all the debate in the US about the secular stagnation. But if you look just at the data, so that's for OECD country here, since the 60s, decade after decade, you have a slowing growth of GDP. And you also have, a big crisis. So one was the financial crisis of 2009. Right now, we had this crisis due to the coronavirus. But even before that, you have this very sluggish dynamic of growth in global capitalism. So, second paradox, we do not have a new era of prosperity, but on the contrary, we have a kind of aging capitalism that is becoming less and less dynamics. Third paradox is the fact that the state didn't step down at all. In fact, one of the reasons where the state was more in retreat in terms of innovation is Europe. And Europe is a big loser of this global restructuring linked to digitalization. If you look at what's going on, we right now have dominant firms that comes mostly from America, but also from North America, from the US, but also to some extent from China. But Europe is mostly is completely marginalized in this process, as are other Asian countries, Africa and South America. Here I just passed a photo from Mariana Mazzucato, because Mariana Mazzucato made very clear that the success of the US is not at all independent of the role of the state. On the contrary, big corporations from the tech sector received a lot of support from the state sector in order to develop their innovation. In fact, most of the key innovation behind this new digital industries were developed in the context of public research or public funding research at the university or military applications or stuff like that. Then we have so that's the third paradox. The state is very much here still, and those who believe that we do not need the state were in fact the big loser of the time. The fourth paradox is concerned labor. I quoted Macron and this idea of the startup as a way to emancipate yourself, to have a kind of more creative work and so on. And I do not deny the fact that in some Californian firms, you have some space for creativity, you have some workers are not too much supervised, and they can have some room of maneuver to develop their project and so on. So that's this idea of work being more or less, lightly supervised. That exists in some space of the contemporary economy. But on the other hand, you also have other places where digital technology are very much mobilized in order to increase dramatically the supervision, the intensification of supervision, and the intensification of work. So here you have this example of warehouse workers that are working with digital command. So they are basically talking to a machine the whole day, and the machine told them to do that, they have to answer. And it's very difficult. Sociologists of labor working on that explain that the room of maneuver of people to realize themselves in such a work is super tiny, which is super negative in terms of psychological and self-esteem consequences. So we also have the other side of digitalization in terms of work that's not more creativity, but on the contrary, a stronger alienation of workers. So we could develop other products, but I would stop here and just try to summarize the first part of my argument. The principle of the digital economy have been implemented by a set of policies that can be defined very by a few elements. First, free trade, free capital flows, and strong competition policy. Second, no public regulation. So the public must stay outward of this new industry and must must trust the entrepreneurs to develop by themselves new services, and in fact must even support them in their disruptive dimension. Then the only work of the state is to defend property right, and that's the main point. And in fact, this is a kind of new doctrine. That's a neo-Schumpeterian doctrine. That's, if you want, the consensus, Washington consensus, plus this idea of entrepreneurship. And so we have this idea of positive role of creative destruction, but we have also the incentive for innovation. And the incentive for innovation, that's very much this emphasis on property rights and on low taxation in order to favor entrepreneurs. Of course, we have problems, and even more than problems, we have some paradox, strong paradox, 30 years from now, from the beginning of the implementation of this agenda. So growth is not here, is not at all realized. On the contrary, we have a process of slowing down of growth, secular process of slowing down of growth that is very much here. Then we also have this idea of the state that is very much necessary to develop industries. Even this kind of new industry like the digital industry, where it developed with the help of the state. That was the case in the US, but that was also the case in China, or if you want, in Russia, where also there is a strong domestic firms in the digital sector. For political reasons, in part, these two countries closed their market to Western big digital players, but that allowed them to build their own national champions in this sector. And then we also have this intensification of substitution of labor to capital due to increased means of supervision of labor due to this development of digital techniques of supervision of labor. Okay, so let's move now toward a more positive analysis of what is going on. I propose to give you a flavor of what could be a political economy of digital domination. So here you feel that there is a kind of oxymoron in the sense that on the one hand, we are still in the realm of political economy, but on the other hand, by putting the emphasis on domination, there is this idea that there is something that is very much political also at stake. There is not only the exploitation, there is a kind of territorial domination that is at stake here. And I will try to clarify my point of view. So here is Jacques Derrida, a famous French philosopher. And in 1993, he wrote this book, Spectre de Marx, where he said that in spite of the fall of the Soviet Union, we will not be, Marx will still stay relevant. And in this book, he explained this concept of spectrum that I think is very useful to understand what is going on with big data and algorithm. The idea of spectrum is this idea that someone else is looking at you. It is looking at you, but you cannot look at him. So there is no synchrony. He is above you, and there is an absolute asymmetry. You feel that it is here, but you cannot face here. And I think that algorithmic governmentality is very much that. We have big data and algorithms that are, if you want, driving our behavior, informing of behavior, using our own information to do that, but we cannot directly face them. And one, if you want a concrete example of that, you can think about Amazon. Amazon is a specific store for everybody. Everybody has its own store on Amazon. When you go on Amazon, Amazon is using various information in order to set up a store that is exactly done for you. And this is this idea of contextualization, individual contextualization of the store that is an illustration of the strength of this algorithmic governmentality. So one researcher that developed this point of view is Shoshana Zuboff. Shoshana Zuboff developed the concept of surveillance capitalism. And surveillance capitalism, it's this idea of mobilizing governmentality, so algorithmic governmentality, this idea of using big data in order to define patterns and anticipate the behavior of the people in order to make money. And that's the origin of Google. Google, what you want is to know what you want and tell and bring that to you even before you think about that. That's this idea. And with this ability to predict the human behavior, these kind of firms are able to make a lot of money, mainly by selling advertisement, but also by more and more driving the behavior of people in the sense that incentivizing them to move in this direction and this direction, or even implementing some kind of smart contract that will constrain their behavior if something occurs that was planned in the contract. So we have this idea in Dubov of mobilizing this ability to predict, to make money. And I think it's a great idea. However, she's not very much pushing this argument very far. In terms of political economy, there is no strong view what is the role of competition, what is the logic of profits, out of what profits are coming, and that's the reason why I'm not completely satisfied with her perspective. But we can also think about these dynamics of digital domination in other areas. And we all need absolutely to think about what's going on in China. And one of the examples, and I developed that in a chapter of the book, one interesting example in China is the development of the Chinese credit system. And this Chinese credit system is in fact kind of ambivalent tool. On the one hand, and that this has been very much discussed in mainstream newspapers, there is this idea of political surveillance, political control of the population of China, and I'm not denying that this occurring, of course. The police in China and political police is using this kind of information to control the people. However, that's not the only thing that is occurring with that. And maybe that's even not the main thing that is occurring with that. In fact, China had huge problems due to liberalization. Of course, there has been a very rapid growth, but the Chinese society was completely transformed by this very rapid commodification. And people are a lot of pain to trust each other, to be satisfied with the transaction they are making. A lot of time there are some kinds of frauds, quality is not there, and so on. And in one sense, you can think about that, about too much commodification and the reverse side of commodification. And if you think about that in these terms, you can think that this Chinese credit systems, and in fact the Chinese are expecting that, is a way to increase the level of trust in the society by implementing a kind of reputational indicators to the various actors, individuals, but also firms, corporations, and even administration, in order to help the people to navigate this society using non-market signals. And I think that this dimension is interesting because it's indicators that what's going on with this algorithmic coordination dimension is not only a kind of super capitalism. It's also a way to introduce new tools of coordination in the economy. So here you probably recognize Charles Babbage, and Charles Babbage is a 19th century scholar. He made tremendous work in the early imagining of computation, but also in political economy. And one of the main points of Babbage is that he explained that it is in the advantage of capitalists to separate knowledge in order to pay less skilled workers only at a relative low price and focus the knowledge in a few people that will be paid at a higher price. So he introduced this idea of the cognitive division of labor. And what we are experiencing with the rise of digitalization, and we experience that very much in the context of global value chains, is a kind of magnification, if you want, of this process of knowledge division and knowledge monopolization. And on the one hand, you have some firms, some corporations that are centralizing the data and controlling the property rights, the intellectual property rights, and also monopolizing the ability to control the cooperation within the chain. And this is something very important because there are various mechanisms at stake here. On the one hand, there is the ability of setting standards and controlling the flow of data, controlling the information systems that allow various operations to be functional at the world scale. So think about the making of a phone. Apple must be aware of all the connections between its suppliers and how they can fit together in order to result at the end of the day in a well-functioning phone. But that's not only that, because when you are controlling the whole chain and the information process at the level of the chain, you are also able to gather a lot of data. And when you're able to gather a lot of data, you are able to innovate very much. And that's what Kaiser, the CEO of Siemens, said in 2016. Data is the holy grail of innovation. And data centralization is consequently a key advantage in terms of competition in the 21st century. And we discussed that with my co-author, Will Milberg, in a paper that was recently published. We discussed this idea of intellectual monopolization in global value chains, and we reinterpreted in this light the famous smile curve of global value chains. So, of course, you have global competition that is, if you want, diminishing the ability to capture value at the production stage. And this is very much linked to a global reserve army, labor reserve army at the world scale. So there are many workers that are underemployed, and this weighs down on wages at a less skilled level. But you also have a more, if you want, positive dynamic in the sense of ability to build advantages. And this is where we put the emphasis in this paper on this idea of intellectual monopolization. And intellectual monopolization, this is this process of controlling the chain and the information system, gathering the data, controlling intellectual property rights. And this enables a few firms to capture a lot of value that is produced at the global level in these global value chains. So the polarization of the distribution of value in global value chains is not only linked to competition and the presence of massive underemployment at the world scale, but also to a process of centralization of knowledge that allow some firms to capture the right. So I think that here you have a little bit more a flavor of what is at stake with this digital domination. On the one hand, you have this spectrum of digital platforms that are able to not really control, but anticipate strongly our behavior and to make money out of that. But we have something also that is much more pervasive. At the social level, there is new possibilities to coordinate the economy beyond prices, and that's what the Chinese system of credit is doing in part. But you have also something in the traditional economy that is at stake. That's not only between firms and individuals, that's also between firms, and that's what we are observing in the context of global value chain, where we have a process of intellectual monopolization, where some firms gather the data, gather the intellectual property, and because of that, are able to control the labor process at the global scales and to innovate and preserve their advantage. Now I will move toward my last argument before concluding. This is the argument of techno-feudalism. So what I want to do with that, of course, I am not saying that capitalism is over. What I'm saying is that there is within contemporary capitalism a strong trend toward something else than capitalism. So the trend is here. I do not say that it will realize finally, but the trend is here and the trend is strong. And in order to understand what I want to say by techno-feudalism, I first must present you what I retain from feudalism. So, of course, feudalism is a complex historical process, and historians wrote a lot of that. So I will not dig into that direction. What I take from the idea of feudalism is just a few elements that seems to be relevant to think about our contemporary moment. So the first thing that I take from feudalism is the general principle of concentration and consumption of wealth. That's an idea that you find very much in the work of Duby, an historian, that explained that what is striking in feudalism, that all the small surplus that exist is flowing toward a very tiny elite that basically consume that without investment. It consumes that in military purchases and luxury purchases. So you have both extreme inequalities and the lack of, if you want, productive drive. The second character that I take from feudalism is this idea of political and economic inseparability of relations of domination. And we have this institution of feudalism that is a dominium, where at the top you have the warriors, the landlords, that are both the owner of the land and the people that organize justice, that organize that police, if you want, some territories, and that also take a tribute from the works of the peasants. So here you have this dynamic of, in the meantime, political domination and economic predation. And this is very, very important. So you have this inseparability of political and economic dimensions. And the third one is specifically this economic dimension. It's an economic dynamic not of production but of predation. And here I'm using, for example, the work of Perry Anderson or Vahabi that explain that you have an appropriative dynamic of allocation of resources, which means that this is competition exists, but it is much more zero-sum game than a positive-sum game, as we have in capitalism, where competition is a drive toward investment and growth. So that's not really what is occurring in feudalism. So briefly, feudalism for me, it's huge inequalities, inseparability of political and economic dimension, and predation instead of production. Do we have something like that in contemporary digital economy? We have some forms of dependency that are both economic and political in one sense. It's very hard for individuals to leave the platforms. Can you imagine your life without Google? Yes, probably that's possible. If I think about my mother is very happy and she's not using that much Google, and she can do that. But for most of us, it will be very difficult to do that. We're using these services every day that make us much more, that help us, if you want, in terms of some uses, concrete uses, but also we need them in order to be connected with the other one. If we stop to use this kind of services, we will get to some extent marginalized. So that's possible, but that's costly, that's difficult. The second dimension is that we have a kind of new and very strong way of subordinating labor. And that's not only labor, that in fact, people in many dimensions. The uses of big data and machine learnings allow to improve very rapidly algorithmic management, which is dominating workers or also dominating people and nudging them, constraining them to specific behaviors. And there are a lot of works about Uber workers, for example, that there are some kind of gamification of their work, but that's kind of nudge that strongly reduce their ability to exert their sovereignty as an individual. And we need also to think about the fact that many services that are made, like, for example, that Uber Eats or Deliveroo and so on, are services that are based on a very concrete and physical work, such as delivering something. But in the meantime, there is also a strong dimension that is linked to the platforms in terms of a kind of memory of the users, their preferences, and their habits and so on, that the individual workers cannot have by themselves. In this sense, they are dependent from the platforms. And we have here this kind of pseudo-individual workers that are independent only formally, but in reality are strongly dependent from the platforms to work and to provide the service they are providing. The second element, so that's the first dimension, that's this dimension of dependency. And the second dimension will be the dimension of conquest, and that's this idea of the conquest of digital fiefdoms. And we can think about that in terms of the idea of data rush. And here there is this quote from the MIT Tech Review that say that there is a kind of scarcity of the sources of data. And what we are observing right now in the past few years is a rush to get access to the new sources of data and to make money out of that. And that's also this idea of nearsec that I think is very good, this idea of convergence, that the various platforms are in fact converging because all of them are generalists in the sense that all of them are, at the end of the day, looking to original data to make whatever kind of businesses. So that will be the first dynamic, a dynamic of, if you want, acceleration to scales linked to the conquest of data sources. But we also have something else. We have a logic of new kind of natural monopoly. On the one hand, we have an absolute scarcity of original data, which in fact reminds to some extent this idea of scarcity of land, which was one of the key dimensions of feudalism. But we have something more. We have now, contrary to land in the traditional land, we have infinite return to scales on intangible assets built out of the data. And this infinite return to scales mean that the biggest platform, the biggest digital actor, the best are its services, the best is its ability to innovate. And so the more people are using it and the more data it is gathering. And in this sense, there is what we observed a very strong growth of these digital companies, but there is also this process of monopolization, because as soon as they are very big, it's almost impossible for actors to step in and to get access to the data. And finally, there is a third dimension that makes me think about feudalism, is the fact that these digital actors are playing a more and more political role. So that's not only direct issues concerning the regulation of speech, and we can think about the fact that at some point Twitter suspending the account of Donald Trump, but there are also more raw data that are very important to be able to just organize our society. And that was revealed in the course of the pandemic when we learned that central banks were relying on data from Apple to make their models. That's the case, for example, here of the Bank of England that is using data from Apple in order to try to capture economic dynamics. But we also have, in order just to build health policies, local governments had to rely on detailed data from Google that Google accepted to make public, but they probably have many other data that could be useful and that we do not know about during the pandemic. So here we have some data about local mobility, and that show, for example, that the presence of people in stores was just 50% of what it is usually, and so on. So that's for a small part of Switzerland, but there are data of this kind for every place. Okay, and there are many other dimensions. You can also think about the role of digital currencies that are emerging by some digital platforms. So it's time for me to conclude this presentation, and I would like to mention this idea of socialization. That is a very important idea in Marx. So Marx explained that there is a historical tendency of capitalism, and this historical tendency is the tendency of making us more and more socialized, in the sense that the division of labor make us more and more dependent from each other, but that also there are capitalist organizations that are more and more social, in the sense that they are not depending on specific individuals, but there are big collectives, big firms that are organizing the economic life. And in fact, we have something like that. And I propose this S-curve of socialization of production. So up to the 70s, we had a kind of national monopolization, and then we had globalization. Globalization, that was kind of a shake-up of the global economic structure with rising competition. But since the 2000s, we are again in the context of monopolization that is very much driven by these platforms. And this process of monopolization is very interesting because right now, the mainstream is moving toward a new policy, toward an increased implementation of antitrust. There are a lot of discussion about antitrust. There are many procedures that are in course. And I'm not convinced that this is a good way to respond to the threat, the real threats related to the rise of dominant digital actors. Why? Because there is some kind of efficiency in the centralization of data and the centralized production of digital services. So here we need to be creative. We need to imagine other way to deal with this rising power of digital platforms. And I think that at the end of the day, the alternative is something more like digital economic democracy versus techno-feudalism. Indeed, the future belongs to the invisible hand of algorithm, in the sense that algorithm could be very strong and already are a very strong way of coordinating, organizing economic transactions. The problem is that these algorithms right now are controlled by big corporations, private corporations, that skewed their use, that bias their use in order to maintain their power and to increase their profits. And we need to think something beyond that. And here I'm just opening the discussion with three indications. The first thing is that we need to make this owner of algorithm or users of algorithm responsible for the consequences of this algorithm. That's true in terms of discrimination, but that can be true also in terms of fostering unsustainable consumption pattern, if you want. So we need to think about looking at the consequences of algorithm and try to build norms in order to regulate that. That will be the first thing. The second thing is this idea of digital sovereignty and digital commons. Right now, the public actors are giving access to a lot of data to digital actors. And this should change, or at least this should be strategized. And especially countries in the global south need to think about their digital sovereignty, what they can do with the data, try to develop their own services. And we need to think also about digital commons that could be accessed worldwide in a whole set of sectors. Finally, the third dimension is that we need to think again about planning. One of the difficulty of planning was cognitive limits due to the difficulty to process information. But right now, planning should be think very differently, because firms like Amazon, Walmart, and so on are processing very much more data than ever planning apparatus so that was possible to proceed. And so we need to return to this discussion about to what extent, and in particular in the context of ecological crisis, planning using, if you want, indicators in nature, so matters indicators, can be used again in order to think and control some forms of more equal and sustainable developmental paths. Well, so I think that's all. I was a little bit long. I hope that you will forgive me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cédric, for the great presentation. It was a very provocative presentation and multidimensional, very well-rounded book and presentation that deals with the digital economy from different standpoints and yet integrated. So you pass through the lenses of ideology, society, politics, and economics, which brings us a very pleasant reading for your book. I would like to comment and ask you a little bit about some aspects of the book. One thing that I like it very much about your discussion is the idea of platforms as infrastructure, and therefore this potential to permeate all the sectors and the social life. And one thing that I would like maybe for you to talk a little bit more about would be the relation of these platforms, also with productive labor and productive capital, because you definitely focus a lot on predation and rents, but you don't talk too much about how they can or they somehow touch the productive side. For instance, if we think about advertising platforms as Google, as also Facebook, we can see more these dynamics of brands. But if we look to Uber, if we look to platforms with personal shoppers, and we see that they bring to the system a lot of surplus value, to which they also redistribute later. But and even these are services that are very low productivity services, and that therefore amplify the magnitude of absolute value in the system, absolute surplus value in the system, to which to drain from. As well, we are now seeing a process through which there is not only the control of nodes from the platforms to capture data, but a movement toward the industrial base. Either Microsoft, Google, Alibaba, Tencent, they are all going to semiconductors, because you focus a lot of on the scale of data as a parameter for competition through platforms in the digital economy, but computing power is also an important vector for the production of algorithms, and they are in a rush in this industrial base to develop the faster processors, the faster AI chips, artificial intelligence chips. This is, I believe, also an important factor, and then this brings us directly to the traditional factories, directly to the manufacturing floor. And just still on this topic, then I believe there is an heterogeneity of platforms and their relation to the productive sector, through which maybe we should have a more detailed mapping than sometimes generalize the advertising platforms. No, and you also mentioned that in the book, when you distinguish the modes of production, feudalism, esclavagism, and capitalism, that one of the central characteristics of feudalism would also be in relation to the labor process and the autonomy. And yet you presented here that we have a tighter grip over the labor process through these platforms. So, and this is a tendency of capitalism, or a very important tendency that would characterize capitalism. So I would want to talk a little bit more between these relations, that because I think I'm definitely correct that there is a lot of predation, but I believe there are also some points in which these platforms contribute to value creation. From Caio Fernandes, which is a postgraduating student in economics of UFRN, and he asks, how do you see the place of underdeveloped countries and regions on the future of geographical labor division in this techno-feudalist system? And we have another question here, some comments and questions from Edemilson Paraná, which is the coordinator of the research group on economy, technology, and society. And he says, since all technology has a fundamental social content within, that means it's socially produced and used, and by that socially determined, and by that socially determined. We could say that these social political dependence relations concerning technology were somehow always the case, isn't it? Even, of course, in capitalism. And he says further, on this conceptual level, could you stress more on the main differences on this aspect concerning this actual conjuncture of capitalism or techno-feudalism compared to past others? And we have a lot of comments here. Thank you for the great presentation. And let me see. We have another question here from DigiLabor. Notions such as digital sovereignty and digital commons have become quite in our area. And I find that interesting. But how do you exactly define them? And what examples do you have? And he also says, your idea of platforms as infrastructures also take into account submarine cables, precious metals, and the entire labor exploitation system in places like Foxconn, as well as environmental issues.
And I thank you very much for bringing them. I think that I will take them in their order. And I'm not sure that we will be able to give stronger response to all of them. But I will first agree with you, Esther, that this articulation between productive and unproductive labor is very important and should be more clearly articulated in this kind of issue. My point is that what is going on with digitalization is a fact that we have a dramatic change in terms of coordination of economic activities. And this so if you want, that's not really forces of production, but that's mainly forces of coordination. And these changes in terms of forces of coordination allow the ability to produce value to be very much disentangled from to capture value. So if you think about firms like platforms that are linked to advertisement, as you said, they are mainly taking out value of the global pool of surplus value, but they are not contributing a lot. And that's true also for big firms like Apple, for example. They are very big in terms of capitalization and profits, but very small in terms of jobs. That's not the case for firms like Amazon. So here you're right, we need to have more refinement. So to what extent Amazon is moving toward a more classical firm, to what extent its ability to coordinate is its dominant feature, that's not very clear. But what is important here is that if you are looking at the origin and uses of profits, we already have some interesting distinction. In the case of Apple, for example, we have not that much investment. That's a firm that is saving a lot. So there is a lot of, if you want, surplus capital that is appropriated and not reinvested. That's not the case in the case of Amazon. So is it just transitory, the time of building a monopoly, or do we really have a new kind of traditional capitalist firms that is just stepping in? And third, we have the example of Uber that is not making profit, and that will sometimes may be able to make profit if it's able to get some automotive cars. But without automotive cars, at least in the global north, that would be very difficult for them to make meaningful money. So you're right. I can only agree on the fact that there need to be some refinement, typology of platforms, and I didn't have the time to present that here. And that also, even if the dimension of appropriation of value is the dominant forms, there is also this kind of industrial dimension that is going on. And maybe there could be a kind of productive turn, but that's not the dominant thing for the moment. The dominant thing, I think, is forces of coordination and not forces of production. And in this sense, we have something that is kind of idiosyncratic. And also, of course, that's important to have that in mind in the context of the long downturn. So in the context of growth is slowing down everywhere, investment is slowing down everywhere. So this rise of this kind of activity where predation is a dominant factor can contribute to make sense to these stagnationist tendencies. Concerning the place of the global south in this process, well, I think it's a very important issue, of course, and you know that for these firms, the global south is a new, not a new, but is a very much important front in order to increase their access to data. In some part of the world, in Asia especially, for example, I think in Sri Lanka or a country like that, Facebook is the main way through which people are going to the internet. So I think that that means that all the data of the people are gathering via Facebook, and that's a very important advantage for these firms. So I think that for the Global South, there is this traditional catching up issue that is going on. And here, this issue of sovereignty is very important, because the data is not that difficult to capture. The data are just there. So that's very much a matter of law, very much a matter of forbidding the ability of firms to monopolize and privatize the data. And then you have the possibility to build services using this data. But everybody is late. That's not only the Global South that is late. In terms of building the data as commons, in all parts of the world, including, of course, in the most developed part of the world, there is this very digital commons are just beginning to be discussed. They are discussed for sometimes, but in terms of policy implementation, that's very much the beginning. And the dominant forms that is taking the discussion, that's not the discussion about sovereignty, so linking the data to political space, or digital commons in the sense of making the data disposable for public services, communities to build their own digital tools. But the main discussion is about competition. And I think that here we have to worry a lot, because the response toward against monopolization is competition. And I will like just to give you one example. In Europe, Google now is constrained to organize some kind of auction on Android phones in order to decide to make available various search engines on its Android phones. And the consequence of that is that the search engines that are winning the auctions are the search engines that are the most exploitative of privacy of the people, that are the most nudging the behavior of the people. Because in order to win the auctions, you need to be able to commit a lot of money. And in order to be able to commit a lot of money, you need to be able to anticipate a high profitability linked to the exploitation of the uses of your search engine by the people. So in one sense, competition will make things even worse, in the sense that this is an incitation to make the more money that you can of the data, instead of fostering use value and fostering common value uses of that. Concerning the social dimension, no, in fact, I think that was more a comment truly than a question, because I think that I completely agree with the colleague that raised this point. There is no strong technological determinism. And if you want, when I put the emphasis on this techno-feudalism, I stress very much the fact that the policy of the Silicon Valley Consensus was among the main reason why we have such a strong monopolization in terms of political power and economic power. And this is the result of specific policies, specific institutions. And in particular, what is very relevant here is the fact that the state, at least in Europe, completely stayed in retreat in terms of controlling the development of this new sector, or making some specific choices in terms of developing that. And I think that in this sense, the social dimension of technological determinism is true in all modes of production. That was true in the context of capitalism, and that is still true in the context of techno-feudalism. Maybe the point that I could make is that in the context of techno-feudalism, the kind of political and social struggle that will occur could have some specific forms. Esther was raising sooner the fact that there are also new modes of building, creating absolute surplus value thanks to these platforms, with the figure of individual workers working for the platforms. I think that's one great example of the fact that in these specific forms of people working for the platforms, which is linked also to this idea of the digital labor, you will have new forms of contradictions. So people will try to raise the standards or to have some kind of control over their work or to have some forms of controls towards their remuneration or trying to increase that. And this is already existing, in fact. You have organizations that are beginning to exist or directly digital workers, click workers, if you want, or in the realm of gig workers for the platforms. And this means that here also the outcome of this social and political struggle is open, and it will determine some forms of regulation of these technologies. So in this sense, the socio-political dimension of technological trajectory is still very much present. Yeah, I think that I may have brought some elements, not, I think, satisfactorily answered all the questions, but at least I touched them. Thank you very much for them.
We have some other bunch of questions. Let me see. Fernanda Utremari, even considering the process of concentration of independence on digital platforms, would you say that there is no competition between them, between countries using them, or even at the lower level? And Jânio, which is a graduate in economic science in UFRN, when you say that we are going to the system of techno-feudalism, I think that remits to a less globalized world. Fernanda also says, also I'd like to hear more about your perspective of capitalism and its attempt to achieve better conditions for humanity instead of achieving better conditions just as a byproduct of its own nature. Jânio, can you say a little bit more about the relations between countries on this system? And Oscar, who is a PhD candidate at UFC. There is a strong movement within UN for the use of big data and artificial intelligence for the production of official statistics, with the active partnership of private corporations. This could lead to a global centralization of data and algorithms, including citizens' data. Could you comment on how this process could affect states and people's sovereignty over data? And we have one more question from Ricardo, and then we close. Mr. Durand, how do you see the role of artificial intelligence in terms of competition from startup initiatives, small applications, in relation to large technology companies and his data infrastructure computing power? And the last one, and how do you analyze the changes that artificial intelligence could be transforming the forms of appropriation of workers' surplus value, mainly of paid work in relation to unpaid work?
Thank you very much for these questions. Thank you for summarizing them, Esther. These are great questions again, and you are not making my life easy. That's kind of challenging to answer them. I have some comments on some I'm not very sure about. The last question, for example, of Mr. Kaminski about this, the implication of artificial intelligence for value production at the point of production. Really, I need to think more thoroughly about that. I think that the implications are not clear. I think that the concept of AI is not that clear too, because we are more talking about machine learning. The dimension of automation, probably automation will increase dramatically, but it's not the case yet, because wages, in part because wages are too low. So there are many dimensions here. So I would not like to comment too much on that, but I would like to comment on the first question you made on startup, about the fact that to what extent startup are able to compete with big platform here. And I think that one of the main points is that big platforms right now are able to buy the startups that are very much that are innovating strongly. So one of the consequences of this situation is that they are able to identify rapidly what are their promising competitors and to bring them home, and maybe to develop the business lines that these startups inaugurated, or just to shut it down if that's not favorable for their business model. So here we have really that's in fact one of the argument that is in favor of competition policy. This is this one, the fact that innovative paths are closed by the big monopolist, and that's true that this is occurring. I don't know well this initiative about concerning the UN and centralization of data, but that allows me to connect to the discussion about the relationship between countries. I think, yes, there is an opportunity to build some global data services that could be useful for everybody. Think about health. Right now, there is this discussion about the vaccine, and that's a huge scandal that there is no free access, free intellectual property right on the vaccine. But there is more broadly this idea that huge database concerning health, if they are centralized by the UN instead of being centralized by big corporation, I think that would be very much better for everybody, and that will be a raison d'être, if you want, a good way to empower UN institutions, because we have a common interest as a humanity to share some of this kind of data. So I think that in the realm of data, there are some opportunity to build a stronger UN institution. However, and I will not elaborate a lot on that here, but that there are strong reasons of opposition or weakening of the UN due to imperialist rivalry and the rise of China and so on. So, of course, that's not an easy way. But if you think kind of abstractly, I think centralization of data is and the building of global data services, for example, in search engine networks, social networks, and so on, that could be a raison d'être for the UN institutions and their empowerment. Concerning the relationship between countries, and that's something different here. And I think that what we are observing on the one hand is a kind of digital fragmentation, and there are a lot of discussion about that, the fact that China has its own digital ecosystems distinct from that of the US. And here we can imagine that there could be a kind of power struggle at the global scales between two main ecosystems, digital ecosystems, that could be a way of fragmenting the world. So we can think about that. But there is also another dimension that is very important in my view. This is what I raised with this issue of global value chains. The fact that even when you think about most industrial physical work, the fragmentation and the organization of the global scale of labor means that there is room for strong monopolization of control of the labor process and for value capture into that. And this is one of the reasons why we are observing the persistence of high level of uneven development, is that in the past decade, we observed a strong movement of centralization of intellectual control on the labor process. And this is very much a problem for developing country and for the increasing or the deepening of unevenness of development at the world scale. Of course, here again, the issue of China is very interesting, because China was in part able to escape this trap because it was able to build its own digital ecosystem. So will we go toward a less globalized world? I'm not sure about that. I think I try. On the one hand, we have this, if you want, this drive toward more globalization, in the sense that gathering the data at the world scale makes sense for many dimensions. On the other hand, we have this kind of international intercapitalist rivalry that could lead to the building of distinctive digital ecosystems. So that's kind of an open process, and I will not make bets on what will occur. Then I will finish by the questions by Fernanda Utrema, and I think that they are very important questions. Yes, I think there are some kind of competition between platforms, but there are competition between platforms as there used to be some kind of competitions between monopolists in the first decades of the second half of the 20th century. There is some competition between them, but there is also some kind of coordination between them. And we already have some proof of that. In particular, there is a case that has been opened very recently in December in the US between Google and Facebook, because regulators captured the fact that Facebook and Google were dealing to limit competition between them in order to protect their rents in terms of the prices of advertisement. So there are examples of collisions between these monopolists. And this is the dynamic of monopolization that I'm talking about. I'm not talking about one firm's immediately taking being the single firms to operate in the digital economy, but more like a few monopolists that are able to collude and to maintain their position. And concerning I'm not sure that I get well the final question about the dynamic of capitalism and of techno-feudalism and their socio-economic impact. And but the comment I would like to do on that is that we have a kind of paradox. To some extent, to have a less productive, material productively driven economy in an age of capitalocene, in an age of ecological crisis, is I will not say good news, but it drives our attention that we cannot follow the path of productivism in all its dimensions like it was done in the 20th century. And so in this sense, the kind of non-productivist drive of techno-feudalism could be, to some extent, inspiring. However, this goes hand in hand with unacceptable and increasing inequalities, and that's the place that we need to think more thoroughly. And I think that the invitation that we have with techno-feudalism is that the fact that coordination of activities, economic activities, could be driven more directly toward use value than toward exchange value. And in this sense, organizing economic coordination toward use value is also a way to limit the bad uses of natural resources, and it's also a way to orient the development, economic development, more toward well-being of collective and individual well-being of the people than toward the maximization of individual consumptions based on the US model. So I think that there is a kind of opportunity here to focus more on use value and real outcome of socioeconomic systems than looking at purely growth of individual consumptions following the American path. And I think that in this perspective, we need to think beyond not only capitalism, but also beyond techno-feudalism toward a kind of, I don't know how you could call that, but some kind of socio-tech ecologism or something like that, or eco-tech socialism. Let's invent a label. But thank you very much for these great questions. I'm sorry I cannot answer them better, but I think that means that all of us have a lot of work to do.
Thank you very much, Cédric. The discussion and your presentation were very enticing, and we had a scope to do our reflections and bring these questions, as you say, forward, as they are not yet all closed, and as you mentioned, there's a lot of work to be done. And we thank you very much for being here with us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the great questions. Bye-bye.
Bye.